be safe. He's called us to be significant. And there are going to be moments where that is difficult and people will reject you, and it's going to hurt like crazy. How many of you love rejection? You're like, yes, reject me, please. That's not how God has wired us. But in the midst, it requires us taking audacious risks. Second thing we have to do is we have to be passionate about it. We have to be compelled by the idea that I want to rub off on those around me. How many of you ever noticed that? How many of you have a dog or have had a dog? Okay? This is what I've learned about the dog. When she gets into something that she's not supposed to be in, whether she gets wet or she gets skunked or something else like that, she can't get close enough to me. I'm trying to keep her away, and she just wants to rub off on me. I believe that we have to be passionate about rubbing off on those around us. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 16, and this is out of the New Living Translation, that says this, preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. I'm compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I don't preach the good news. That's what our heart has to be. That, man, I can't, if I don't share the good news of Jesus, it's just going to drive me nuts. With passion, with intent. I believe that effective influence does not happen accidentally. Let me ask you this. For those of you that drive to work or drive to the grocery store, do you just get in the car and randomly start driving in different roads? For those of you that live in the country, I'd challenge you to try this sometime and see how it works out for you. Decide, you know what, I'm really hungry. It's time for dinner. I'm going to go to my favorite restaurant. I'm just going to start driving down this road. And then when I get down there, I'm just going to kind of make a turn. But you know what? Eventually, if I make enough turns, I might get to the place where I want to eat. How many of you know what's going to happen? You're going to get really, really super hungry. And you're probably going to end up in the Atlantic Ocean someplace. Because without intent, you aren't going to arrive at the destination. This is what I believe, that too often as Christ followers, we're not intentional about being salt and light. We think it's just going to happen on its own. See, I believe this, we have to be properly positioned to leverage the influence that God has created us to have. I'll challenge you with a couple examples. We're going to use the salt and light thing again. Next time you have some really bland food that needs to be salted, what I'm going to tell you to do is instead of put the salt on the food, take the salt shaker and shake it on the table next to it, and then take a bite and see the kind of influence it has over your food. How many of you know what's going to happen? It's still going to be the same old bland food, right? You have to have contact. Remember we talked about that last week, proximity determines impact, right? Without the proximity of the salt to the food, there's no impact. Same thing with light. How many of you know that when the lights go out in the house, you don't want somebody 3 rooms over with a flashlight? You want somebody with a flashlight where you are, because proximity determines impact. We have to be intentional about shining our light and being salt in the world that we live in. Finally, the last thing, because the tacos, the smell is like, whoa. So they left that door open out there on purpose. I closed it earlier. I'm telling you, they opened it on purpose to get us hungry. Good sales technique. Good sales technique. The last thing that we have to do is we have to love outwardly. I believe that there's 2 levels to this loving outwardly. I believe it begins in the family. Because Jesus said this in John chapter 13, verses 34 to 35. A new commandment I give to you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this will everyone know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. How many of you know that that's easier to do sometimes? How many of you have had siblings or have several siblings maybe? How many of you know that sometimes you don't love your siblings a whole lot? So other times you're like, oh, yes, I love you. You're so wonderful. But Jesus says the way that everyone will know that we're carriers of the gospel is how we love each other here. Amen? But how many of you know it's not good enough for just to be here? She's not feeling loving at the moment. As the song says, she's lost that loving feeling. No, oh, she's going to get it back in a moment. She's young. It comes back in a hurry. But how many of you know that he calls us also for the love to extend outside? Because he said this in Mark chapter 12 and verse 31, love your neighbor as yourself. Ouch. How many of you know that one's a hard one sometimes? But in order for us to truly be an influence with the good news in the world that we live in, we have to love people. I would say this, more than we love ourselves. That loving others more than ourselves is a tough one at times. But I believe this, that our number one mission is to influence